Mr. Hamp.
Well, good evening, everyone. Real quick review of our plan for this evening. Mr. McCormick is going to walk us through the capital investment program, and then Mr. Shaw will lead us through a review and presentation of the various enterprise funds. And following that, we'll have some information from me regarding next steps, where we are currently in the process and where I think we're headed, some possible paths, and hopefully some perhaps discussion or questions from the council. A quick note of sort of connection here. The capital investment, the first part of our presentation this evening, does have some relationship to the general fund. Once we conclude that, however, you'll understand, and Mr. Shaw will confirm, that the various enterprise funds have less of a relationship and bearing on the general fund and sort of operate as freestanding enterprises in and of themselves. But with that, I'll pass it off to Mr. McCormick.
So, thank you, Mr. Hamp, and good evening, Mr. Mayor and members of council. So a couple of mechanical reminders on how the capital investment program and the corresponding fund works first, and then I'll kind of go top to bottom over the projects and try to tie them back to the expenditures back to revenue sources. The plan can be found on page 272 of your city manager's budget if you want to look at the plan in full. All the full plan does is add some extra columns that kind of detail to each project, like the department impacted, the proposed funding source, whether an item is an outlay or reserve, and the comp plan, and the reference to the comprehensive plan that the project works with. The slide in the presentation has omitted those columns just so it'll be a little bit easier to read over an electronic meeting. It should be noted that it's a multi-year fund, which means if any of these projects are not completed during the fiscal year, the appropriation will remain intact until the project is complete. So working from top to bottom, the top are the uses of funds, the bottom are the sources of funds. The first two items kind of work together. A few years back when we set this fund up, we made the decision, or council made the decision, to move the jail debt payment for the current debt payment at the jail to the CIP fund and pay it from there. We matched it up with some recurring revenue that we were getting from Rockingham and Harrisonburg from the buy-in for their portion of the jail, to try and set a reserve up so that when that buy-in cuts off in fiscal year 2025, there's a reserve set up in the CIP fund to pay that debt payment. That payment runs out in about 2033, I believe, is the last year of that payment. And at some point, we're going to have to begin funding this a little bit locally, but this takes a lot of the pressure off of that funding. So if you look at the top two, the $294,000 and the $341,447, the $294 represents the debt payment for next year. The $341 represents the amount going into the reserve, and that'll go in with the current reserve balance that's there of about $294,000. That lines up, if you go down to the sources, with the $499,079 from the local budget. As mentioned, the $499,079 is sourced from the Rockingham-Harrisonburg jail payment, which is about $635,000. So your hope would be over the next few years, or if you have any more revenue, to at least get your funds from your local budget or funds from your operating budget to $635, so that will offset that payment when it falls off in 2025. It's also those two numbers, the 294 and the 341, are a little bit more than the 499, so it's also funded a little bit from the local funding, which is your fund balance from the previous year. The next item is the West End Fire Station. That's classified as a reserve right now. You could potentially use those funds to do a land study, a space study, hire an engineer, or pay for some land. And those funds are sourced from the assigned reserve, the second fire station, which was made by combining the Basic City Soccer Complex Reserve and the Sunset Park Reserve, putting those together in the general fund and transferring them to the CIP. The next project is the regional radio system. That's a radio system that's a SAW system, Augusta County, Stanton, and Waynesboro, that we'll be a part of going forward, and it's $50,000, I believe, to pay for a consultant. Next item is Greenway Phase 4, and it's $252,927. It's mostly funded by that very first revenue source, the VDOT TAP grant, $202,000, and that's an 80-20 match. So a little bit of that, about $50,000, is funded from an assigned Greenway reserve in the 110 fund. Next two items are both fully grant funded. That's the Lost Springs Park and the South River Preserve, and they're set off by items that start with the NRDA down in the sources column. Next item is heating and air conditioning for the Gorsuch. We've been trying to put some money into the heating and air systems at the Gorsuch to replace systems that they're seeing that are starting to have issues, and that'll replace, I believe, five pieces of heating and air conditioning. And that's funded completely from the balance needed from local funding at the very bottom, that's $753. Next item down is the Southern Corridor Reserve. That's towards the second payment. Currently, there's about $1.4 million in that reserve. This will take it to about 1.8. Total payment will be a little bit over $2.1 million for both payments on that. And so this item will likely appear again on your 2023 CIP to wrap up the commitment there. Next item is the 8th Street Bridge and Culvert. Council's already appropriated some funds for that. I believe that project in aggregate is about $1 million. This should wrap the funding up for that, and that is funded partially by the VDOT revenue sharing grant, which is 50-50 match, the 180-287, second item down on sources, and then partially from the balance needed from local funding. Next item is the Rockfish Run Steep Stream Restoration, and that's fully grant funded, and that is marked with the SLAF grant, Rockfish Stream for $101,150. Final local item is an elevator upgrade at the library for $100,000, and it says upgrade. I don't know that it's an upgrade so much. It's just to get that elevator working at the library and keep it in compliance for ADA purposes. And then last item are various projects. It's a little bit confusing because over on the left in the normal CIP, I believe it's noted as CDBG, but that's CDBG, just a way to appropriate your CDBG funds, and that's $158,549. Couple of things are notable. Couple of notable omissions on this, or would be the take-home cars. We're able to fund 3 through fund balance, but those are just maintenance cars for your police department, Sunset Park, and the Basic City Soccer Complex, and then the little bit of funding left needed for the Southern Corridor. There was also an economic development stormwater project that was cut, as well as some funding for, I believe, an environmental study for some economic development. There's also no new progress towards the museum, but you are still holding about $570,000 in the general fund to offset that cost. So I know that's pretty dense and a lot of information, but if anybody has any questions, the last thing I would point out is this is balanced, and you do have funds available in the budget presented to fund these projects and to make this version of the capital investment program work in balance and move forward.
Are there any questions for Mr. McCormick or comments from council?
Yeah, I just offer, thanks Cameron for that overview. Would just offer up, I guess just for conversation to see what folks think about the, as I'm understanding again, the 944 for the Weston Fire Station is a result of the combination of D assignment of funding towards Sunset Park and the Basic City project to to generate the funds for that. Did I hear that correctly?
Yes, sir. So there is there was assigned reserve set up for those two items in the general fund that were assigned in your CAFR last year, and that is the 944 is the combination of those two and reallocation to a Weston Fire Station.
Right. So I would just throw out for conversation. I have an interest that I would appreciate an exploration of incurring some nominal debt of $4 million or so to accomplish the fire station and Sunset Park. That reserve alone will get us 4 years of debt payments plus a little, and would offer that up for conversation purposes. Because otherwise, it's literally multiple steps back for those other projects.
I have no interest in going $4 more million in debt. That would be my conversation.
Terry, if you were saying West End Fire Station and Sunset Park. And
That's right.
does that equal the $4 million, or does that take care of something else in there too?
Well, I mean, I don't know to the extent that we really have a budget figure for the Weston Fire Station. I'll let staff sort of chime in on that, but I think with the balance of it's I don't think even 2 years into the CIP of a 5-year CIP, and we've now walked back two of our priorities to fund a new priority. Whereas if we transfer that into a debt service at the rates that they are now, and escalation over time, I mean, it may sound great that we just keep on socking money away, but any recent experience that anybody's had with the cost of material, time, and labor will tell you that it's only going to get more expensive. So we may, it's a classic tale of stepping over a dollar to pick up a dime. I think my fear is that we continue to sock money away, costs continue to rise. Our ability to then eventually either having to continue to wait to deliver a product that our citizens want, or incurring debt that, again, 4+ years of debt service is already sitting available.
When was it, Mike, that the voters in Waynesboro voted to build a fire station that was never built?
So that was in 2007 or 2008.
Okay.
And I think to respond to Mr. Short's question, I think the current budget estimate for this fire station is $2 or $2.1 million. And that contemplates basically the purchase of raw land and construction of a new facility.
I just like to add, while I appreciate what you're saying, Mr. Short, I'm not comfortable right now with a loan of $4 million.
Yeah, and I appreciate that. I guess my question I'd have back would be how might we accomplish this and it not actually end up costing taxpayers more money? Because there's a distinction here about that there's a balance of, it's a core function of government. We have a fire chief who says that we've needed a Weston fire station. We need one today. We've needed one for a long time. The cost will continue to rise, probably outpacing not only the consumer price index, inflationary values, but also even a nominal 3% interest rate over the life of the loan. Again, waiting actually makes it more expensive for taxpayers, and I would say respectfully that I think that's just an honest observation. The longer we wait, the more costly it's going to become for taxpayers. And so while it might feel good to not entertain a borrowing. It's, again, the grand scheme of things, a nominal investment for something that the taxpayers are expecting us to deliver.
Mr. Short, haven't you said in the past we can only tax the 20-some thousand people in Waynesboro so much?
I have, and actually we're able to accomplish this at holding the line at 90 cents.
But if, we have other debt that we're going to be borrowing in the next phase of the high school. If and when we start the connector road, we're going to have debt there. If the museum steps up, we're going to have debt there. If soccer comes in, we're going to have debt there. We have a lot more pressing issues, and I think everybody on council wants the West End Fire Department. If I go out and I quiz the community and the people that I talk to, their interest right now is more on the fire department and less on Sunset Park. That's the people that I'm talking to.
Yeah. Well, I go again to an experience just a couple of years ago where we had 200 people say that our number one quality of life project in the city of Waynesboro is Sunset Park. And again, I would respectfully offer that it's a combination of catching up, keeping up, and getting ahead. And that to be a viable and a sustainable city, and again, we are competing for tax dollars. We are competing for new residents. We are competing for businesses. The businesses that I've spoken to say that quality of life investments attract high quality labor that want to choose Waynesboro and choose it for a community to live in. And that means continuing to develop strategic projects that capitalize on our identity as a community, and that is one of outdoor recreation. I mean, from the success of the Crozet Tunnel, other East End improvements that are underway and funded, and that we hope to be funded, and along with Sunset Park, it's a suite of projects that create a transformation for our East End that for generations has been neglected and ignored. And so, delivering on again, a $54 million budget, 130 some budget after you factor in all expenses annually, and we're talking about $4 million to deliver the three things that all five of us prioritized in November. Just a couple of months ago, all five of us said that those were our top priorities. Just 5 months ago. So for me, I think it's a balance of catching up, keeping up, getting ahead expenses, being strategic and wise about that, not getting into the roles and functions of government that that traditionally aren't particularly very advisable. And things that we're talking about from a Weston Fire Station to again, if we'd done the fire station 15 years ago, Mr. Allen, we could have delivered it for a fraction of the cost than the cost we're talking now. So that's why I think we all get elected to make difficult decisions and take action, and so that's why I would offer.
Well, you keep throwing up the 15 years ago with the fire department that went to a referendum that was sold to the public without full information of the total cost to it. It was for buying a piece of property, and I'm not for sure, Mr. Hamp or Mr. Shaw could correct me, if even the building was included in it. But there was no equipment, there was no personnel, there was no new trucks. At the time, their plan was to double the size of the fire department, or at least add more companies out there. Then once they found out that wasn't going to happen, because what the public had been sold was nowhere near the truth of the cost once they started to equip and man it. Am I right or wrong?
I think that the building was included, and there were at least several parcels of land that were examined, and so pricing for land was incorporated, but the price did not include operational costs, did not include, the cost of manning the station or buying equipment outside of the building.
Well, as I understand it now, we're not going to be buying new equipment or more manpower. We're moving one engine company from the main house to the new house, right?
That's my understanding as well.
Right.
That's my understanding too.
And if I could just add to that, I remember the building cost was it was a large building. It was a building probably that was more than just to meet a need. Is that correct? The plans for the building of the fire station several years ago.
I think the building was, we never really landed on a specific design, but I think that what was contemplated did in fact exceed sort of the expectation of the elected body. But I don't think it would be entirely accurate to say that the building itself was prohibitively expensive. But I do know that the models that were shown sort of exceeded what I think at the time would have been a practical application, a more practical substation view.
Let me just add, Mr. Short, I can appreciate, I would love to see a sunset park, but I see that more as a want at this time. When the roads on this side of town are in terrible condition, it's hard for me to justify a park when the roads to get to that park are in such bad shape. And that's just where I stand. I see it as more of a want and not a need. The fire station I see as a need.
Well, and unfortunately, I have to agree with Mr. Short on this one. I attended a bunch of meetings with him with our plants that are trying to grow, and they're saying we need this in order to attract the labor force that we want to attract in our city and attract the residents in that we want to attract in. Otherwise, it's all for naught. The park and the way our society is viewing parks and greenways is what attracts people into your community that are good taxpayers, that are contributing to the community and not relying so much on public service. And that's coming straight from the business owners when we were meeting with them on a regular basis.
If I can maybe throw a task towards the staff, we're sort of walking into this from the question of the CIP and the designation of funds rather than what we often do when I know we talk about some of the debt issues. We talk about our overall debt and our capacity for debt and the limits that we have set for ourselves and the limits that are there. So that may need to be part of this conversation. It's an intriguing idea to say, can we go ahead and jump on getting, as has been laid out, several of the priorities that I think this council and other councils have had for several years, but at what cost? And what does that look like for our overall picture? Mr. Allen brought up the fact that there are other projects on the horizon, and we can anticipate some of that. And what does that mean when we get to another point and say, okay, now when we look at the high school, when we look at some of the other projects that we know are coming down the road, does this limit our ability to take care of those if we take on even a relatively small amount of debt? Again, not a trifle, but less than the first phase of the high school for certain. I don't know that we have all that information at our fingertips or that that's the meeting agenda that we had for tonight, but I think that's something we do need to review if we're going to consider this kind of option.
Yeah, I would just offer that too is if we're going to have the conversation, I would love to talk about infrastructure and taking opportunities for that too. There's the state offers a revenue sharing program where there's a 50-50 match. We could develop an infrastructure component of a borrow that could take a significant leap into addressing the inventory of, as Ms. Williams, as you mentioned, of our street conditions in many aspects of the city, where we could participate and attempt to be successful at getting, making application for X number of additional miles of repaving, and supplement that with again, a borrowing. I think the distinction here that I would challenge all of us, again, and that's part of I think our job is to challenge all of us of what kind of, to Mr. Hamp's point yesterday, what kind of city do we want to have? Where we are we just going to talk about things, or are we actually going to deliver on the goods and services that I think our taxpayers send their hard-earned money for us to deliver? We're not talking about building an amusement park here. We're talking about core functions of government that complement our identity and who we want to brand ourselves so that we may be competitive with our neighbors. And we're not going to achieve that by, again, that's what struck me with Cameron's presentation this evening about, and that we're fully acknowledging that the money that we've been setting aside for two prominent and important recreational investments in the city, we're zero lining those resources away, and we're reassigning it into a new priority birthed by COVID and a recognition of what the voters want. And I'm saying that resource may provide enough flexibility to accomplish a multitude of things and provide a funding path over the next 3 to 4 to 5. Someone earlier that there's a lot of comparisons about government should be run like a business. I couldn't agree more, because what a business does. A business comes up with a strategic plan about how do they grow their business, how do they make it such that shoppers and customers want to call their business a destination. That's what we're talking about this evening. We have a choice about how do we remain relevant and desirable to continue to grow and to thrive from all functions of our community. And I think that requires some difficult conversations, and again, that's why we all signed up for the job. So that's what I have. Thank you.
To Dr. Hostetter's point, I think certainly the staff can assemble some information about borrowing. We see projects on the horizon as I think several council people have alluded to. I think there was an expectation on the part of the school board that we would have a second phase of the renovation of the high school. I think, if we're to make real progress on the industrial park property that the city owns, that's an investment that would probably, I think most certainly require borrowing. We also know that in a couple of years, we have a balloon payment that will need to be made on a bond refunding that was done some years ago that we'll have to pay off the balance of that, and that will be $8 or $10 million that will be essentially refinancing. It's not a new borrowing. So there are a number of things on the horizon there that are worth assembling and taking a look at in the long view. And then there are localities that often will look at those opportunities and say, well, are there smaller projects that they would add to those borrowing to take advantage of the cost of borrowing? It's not inexpensive to go to the bond market. It's a different process than just going to a commercial bank and borrowing money. So I think we would be glad to assemble that. We've had conversations certainly with our financial advisors about our debt schedules, and we keep up with opportunities for refinancing, and we also talk about opportunities for borrowing. And we feel like we need to bring you some information about what are reasonable debt limits, and what would be a policy that you might want to consider for debt, and we're glad to do those things. I think it's one of those things where certainly as we look at it, as a staff, we would say that there is an argument to be made for, whether or not you take a project on now so that, it doesn't inflate in cost. The balance of that is that when that happens, that you pay the inflation once at the time that you take the project on, whereas if you borrow money today, you will pay that interest every year until the note is paid. And so you really have to do some analysis to say, well, where is the break point where the net present value of money, starts to erode because of that interest payment. And so, again, we have professionals who help us work through those issues. If I could make an editorial comment, it would be that my observation over a period of years here is that we certainly are experienced in taking on large projects. And when we get into the enterprise funds, we can point to some very expensive large projects that we've taken on. We have experience borrowing money that we see school renovations and new schools built and things like that. But what I would observe is that oftentimes when we look at what we have available in fund balance, what we can pay cash for, and if you can pay cash for something, you should, as a community of our size and with our tax base, be able to look at a $1 or $2 million project and say we could pay cash for that. But what happens is that the projects we want to do are easily set aside because of things that come up that we have to do or that are urgent. That we had money that we had to divert from Sunset Park to the Florence Avenue Bridge, for instance. There were, and that's what we have to do. You have to open the bridge. I think you look at a fire station. I think the fire chief has made a compelling argument for the need, and I look at other communities of our size and I say we're deficient. We should have a West End substation. I think it's maybe more accurate to call it a substation than a fire station. And that, in a lot of folks' mind, I think of the average taxpayer, and it's your job to speak for them, but as an average taxpayer, I say, oh, well, I thought that's what I got for, my base pay, that's basic cable, isn't it? And so you look to, again, that will push, a quality of life project out of the way. And it's a great project. Sunset Park could be a unique asset for the community, and you as a council have obviously recognized that. We don't need to tell you that. But what we find is that, oftentimes those necessary things are going to take precedent and suck up the funds that might be available for something that would be more of a quality of life project for us. I'll stop editorializing, but to be more direct, we're certainly glad to come back and present some information to the council about not just borrowing for these specific projects, but also maybe a broader view of things that we all know are on her horizon, what they would cost, and what debt service, especially. I think that's the big thing, is you got to cover debt service.
There aren't any additional thoughts or comments or questions around the capital investment, we'll move then into the enterprise fund presentations.
I think most of you are well aware that the enterprise funds, which include the water fund, sewer fund, stormwater fund, and refuse fund, are self-supporting and self-balancing funds. And as proprietary or business type activities, each of the enterprise funds is supported by fees for service rather than by tax dollars of the general fund. And in fact, each of the funds makes a contribution back to the general fund for overhead and administrative services that are provided from the general fund, such as accounting or payroll services, billing, IT services, legal, purchasing, but even general administration. And the amount of that contribution or overhead allocation is determined by a third-party audit that we periodically have an auditor who comes in and evaluates our system and says, this is really what is a fair allocation from the funds for the services provided by the general fund. And then we tune that up over through the years until we're ready to do another audit. You might recall from the presentation of the general fund budget last night that we noted a $1.8 million interfund transfer that's reflected as revenue in the general fund, and that's this overhead allocation. And that's the payment from the 4 enterprise funds to the general fund, and it's reflected as an expense in each of the enterprise funds. The total annual the economic activity of the 4 funds is approximately $13.5 million. For each of the enterprise funds, we conduct periodic rate studies, and the studies vary a little bit according to the enterprise, but generally speaking, they're meant to evaluate the overall efficiency of the fund, its financial position and stability, and most specifically, whether the fees that are charged for services can support the operational and capital needs of the fund, and then also grow the retained earnings of the fund to an amount that creates financial stability. Rate studies also examine the structure of the rates for fairness. In other words, as you look at water rates, sewer rates, you'll see that there are different charges that are for the fixed fees or for connections based on the size of the service. So, as service gets larger, pipes get larger, more service is available to that user, the fees vary. And so there are philosophies about, who should pay. Do you pay are you trying to give protect your residential customers most? Are you trying to give incentives to commercial customers or industrial customers? Are there some rate structures actually give discounts for more water that you use? Some rates create penalties the more water that you use to try to enforce conservations. And so the rate study takes a look at all of that and says, is your rate structure in and of itself fair? That what you charge per 100, or 1,000 gallons of water versus what it costs to connect versus the monthly service fee? And are you covering fixed cost in the fund, things like debt service and so forth, off of fixed revenues versus operational costs? Being with operational revenues. And so it's a fairly complex analysis. That we also look at affordability and competitiveness, that there are some standards, industry standards, that say a typical household shouldn't have to pay more than 2.5% or 3% of their income for water and sewer services. And we also look around us. We can only operate and charge for the system we operate. So our costs are, our cost is really what it costs us to run our service. But we still need to be aware of what it costs for water and sewer services, and especially nearby jurisdictions. And typically, the result of the study is a multi-year schedule of rates that's proposed to ensure the sustainability of the fund and hopefully smooth increases to customers over time. And so in the absence of rate studies, and I've been here some years where we didn't have a good schedule. If you went out and borrowed money to do a big project, well, suddenly customers' rates would lurch and you'd have a 10 or 13 or 14% rate increase. And what you really want to do is say, well, we'd much rather have, a 1 or 2 or no rate increase at all in some years, so that we smooth that out and don't have big lurches. In virtually all of the funds, but especially the water, sewer, and recent years of stormwater funds, regulatory compliance has become a driving influence in the cost of doing business. In the sewer fund, for instance, we operated for nearly 2 decades under consent orders from the Virginia Department of Environmental Quality. And those consent orders essentially demanded that we fix leaky sewer pipes and that we upgrade our sewage treatment plant, and it resulted in tens of millions of dollars of investment, which that has to be passed on to the customer. So as we sit here today, about a third of the expense in the sewer fund is for debt service, and that's resulted from those capital improvements. And even moving forward, that we're currently out of a consent order, but the understanding with the DEQ is that we will now take on a regular maintenance program for the replacement, especially of leaky pipes. You'll hear us refer to inflow and infiltration, and it basically means you have sewer pipes that leak. And the water fund compliance with the Virginia Department of Health consent order back in about 2008 or 9 prompted us to construct a $12 million water treatment facility, and which cost, the ongoing cost of that is more than $800,000 a year. Our designation as an MS4 stormwater community, that's a municipal separate storm sewer system community, requires that we get a natural pollution discharge elimination permit. And it really shifted the focus of the program that we had in place from working on trying to rectify and correct localized flooding in neighborhoods to regulatory compliance. And I think we actually have a stormwater capital improvement plan. We were making good progress working through the projects in the plan. The council had borrowed money, and I think we were headed in the right direction. Well, MS4 comes along, and again, a lot of your emphasis shifts from just correcting those local, neighborhoods scale flooding problems to dealing with eliminating pollution. And so, that I think in that fund especially, you can predict that it's going to become more expensive to operate that fund because of that. That you'll hear us refer at some point to the Chesapeake Bay Act TMDL requirements. That's total maximum daily load. And these are requirements that are pushed down to the local level that says basically they look at the local receiving streams and rivers, in our case, the South River, and say that we have to meet certain goals to reduce pollutants, that's mostly nitrogen, phosphorus, and certain types of heavy metals, to the river system. And so if you look at, I think a lot of you are familiar with the big stormwater pond that we converted to wetlands over at Jefferson Park. We call it Mulberry Run. That a lot of that was done in order to gain credits against these TMDLs. That the project that had originally been engineered over there actually had a lot more work downstream correcting stormwater pipe problems, but we had to gain credit through the reduction of nutrient loading mostly, and that's why that pond was built the way it is, with about half of that. That's about a $1.6 million project, half of it being grant money, because grants are available to reduce pollutants, and half of it being a loan that we took out through the state. Going to take a little closer look at the budget for some of the enterprises. And in short, what we're proposing for this fiscal year would be no increase in proposed water rates, a 3% proposed increase in sewer rates. That we'd actually, through our rate study, been scheduled for 1.5% rate increase last year, or the current fiscal year, 2021, and then a 1.5% increase for this year. And because of the pandemic, we did not pursue the rate increase last year. So that's 2 years worth of rate increase. Last year, we discussed an increase to the stormwater utility fee from $3.96 per ERU. That's equivalent residential unit. That's the monthly cost that goes to the typical homeowner. To increase that to $5.56. Again, one of the things that we've done with that enterprise is to take debt service that had been in the general fund and put it into that fund, and then we're trying to build a balance there to be able to take on capital projects out of the fund. So that would increase, homeowners' bill from $3.96 per month to $4.56 per month. And then we're proposing $1.50 per month increase to the refuse collection rates. And again, that was something that we proposed last year and deferred because of the pandemic. And we'll get into a little more detail about that. But we did a rate study of the refuse fund in 2019. And one of the issues that is highlighted there is that because of our partnership in the Augusta County Service Authority landfill out at Jollyview, we have obligations to capital improvements there. And in the fairly near future, they will want to open a new cell, and that the money that we hold in our capital reserve there and some money we've been building in our capital reserve here at the city are not going to be sufficient to cover our cost in doing that. And so our proposal would be that we start to put an additional charge on refuse collection to customers to be able to offset some of those capital costs. If we look at the increase in the sewer fund, the 3% would result for the average residential customer. That most homes have a 5/8 inch meter, and the average home uses about 10,000 gallons of water by monthly. So the change on their bill would be about $3.44 per month, and that results in a change of approximately $20.64 per year. Looking just quickly at, I don't want to belabor this, all of this information is in the budget document that you've received. So I won't, I'll just quickly hit that, the water fund, again, we're not proposing to have additional fees or an increase in the rates there. We do see some growth in revenues simply because of new connections primarily coming online contribute to the fund. I would, make one note that you do see some transfer from net position. In other words, that's to, basically taking retained earnings in that fund to help balance the budget. It's the sort of thing where that fund actually is in a very good position. It's a healthy fund. And that's not a practice that you would want to persist, because it is, again, a standalone fund, and you would eventually drain your retained earnings, but you've got more than $1 million of retained earnings in that fund. I would warn that we foresee a large capital expense looming, and that we'll need a large clarifying tank, a water tank at the water treatment facility. We're studying that now, and that'll be an expensive endeavor to take on, probably $1 million project. Conceivable that you could save money within the fund to do that, but a lot of that will depend upon how soon we need to construct that tank and what its ultimate costs are, where we stand with the fund at that point in time. Again, not a lot of change in the fund itself, about a 1.4% increase, and the fund is balanced at its current rates. The sewer fund is a fund that seeds now for projects that are currently slated. And when those are exhausted, we either have to generate money in the operating fund of the sewer fund to cover those costs. Or, we would have to look at a collection of projects and bundle a borrowing, whether that be through one of the state programs or, through a general bond issue. The other issue in any of these funds is we also incorporate rolling stock. You notice in the past year that we've come to you with a couple of requests for dump trucks or heavy equipment in the funds that had been programmed, but that we deferred because of our concern as to whether the funds would suffer, through the pandemic. That we had some concern about, whether you would have an economic downturn and have more folks struggling to pay bills and that sort of thing. Fortunately, that's not proven to be the case. And then, as I've mentioned, if you look at the debt service in the sewer fund, that the fund itself is about a $6 million fund, and a third of that, a little more than a third of that, is simply paying debt for the projects that we've done and the expansion of the sewage treatment plant. I want to take a quick look at something that we keep an eye on. And it's, that issue of affordability. We're pretty fortunate. There's Draper Aden is an engineering firm in the state, and then there's some other folks that put together these rate analysis, and it provides a dashboard. And this one was last updated about a year ago, so we're expecting a new update. But it's a good tool, and it allows that you can go in and compare, the rates of your locality or service authority to whatever, we're comparing to all of the utilities in the Commonwealth who responded to the survey in this particular screen, but you could refine it to utilities that are most like you or however you want to do it. But what I would call your attention to is that we're looking now at a water bill comparison. What this does is how does the water bill of the city of Waynesboro compare to other utilities? And so the first meter up here basically, shows that the typical water bill for a customer in Waynesboro, the water portion of that bill is about $30.44 for 5,000 gallons of water. The median in the state is about $36.44. So we're a bit below the median. And, that means basically $36.44, of course, means that half of the respondents charge less than that, half charge more. The minimum response was $11 and the maximum was $70. Our one-time fees, that's the connection fee. That's the first time if a developer comes in, they want to connect a new home to the system, we charge a facility fee. And the facility fee is meant to cover the cost for capital that the collection of users have already invested in that system, and that developer's share of that capital, so to speak. It's like a buy-in. And our connection fee for water is about $2,700, a little more. And the median, again, is a bit more than that at $3,000. This little meter is an interesting one because it's a measure of affordability. And what it does is looks at the median household income in your community. And so what percentage of that is going to water and sewer services. And you should aim to try to keep that, below 3%. And so ours for water alone is in pretty good shape. If you switch over to sewer, the story's a little bit different in that, and as we've talked about, because of the condition of our sewer system as it had, as we started, say, 20 years ago in earnest in trying to correct some problems, we have incurred a lot of expense, and that expense is passed on to the customer. And so our median, we're actually a bit above the median for 5,000 gallons of usage. We're at $51, and the median is $46. when we look at the service, the one-time connection fee, again, about $200 more than the median as we sit here. Now, we're certainly not the most expensive, but neither are we the least. And in terms of affordability, we're still not in too bad a shape. But to really get a picture of that, you want to look at the combined. And so if you look at the combination of things, we're right at the median of the state, or the collection of users here. A lot of these are service authorities as well as municipal servers. So we're right at the median. And that in terms of affordability, we're still certainly a little bit below what an industry standard would say is affordable. Service connection fees are, right at the median. So I think in terms of, affordability, which I would assume is certainly a top priority of the council, is you can say we're affordable. We really need to be careful that, that you can't push too much harder, especially on the sewer side. That's where I think as we as a staff talk and negotiate with the DEQ, we have tried in recent years to figure out ways that we could stay in compliance, but do it in a more affordable way. That we found ourselves in a big hole years ago, and it took a great deal of effort to try to dig out in terms of our relationship with the regulators. I think we're in a much better space now, but we've got to be careful that we hold up our end of the bargain and continue along with some of the routine maintenance work. Unless the council has any questions on this particular screen, I'm glad to play with it. This is something you can find online if you typed in Draper 8 and dashboard, but it's a fun one to play with and to try to get to understand how we compare to other utility providers, and then how our affordability stacks up.
I have a question, Mr. Shaw, that not directly on that screen. When does that sewer debt start to retire? Now that it's been a while since that has been worked on?
The last of it is many years out. Some of the biggest debt doesn't fall off until into the 2030s. The sewage treatment plant itself was the biggest single debt that we took on. And I don't want to put a bad number out there, but I'm thinking that was by itself more than $30 million. And we also received some grant money. We received a significant grant really on the sewage treatment plant, but that debt, we can give you that information exactly, I'm sure, in a little bit of time, but it's way out there. Mr. McCormick, do you have anything to maybe a little more exact comment there?
Sure. So I'm just pulling the debt schedule from the audit from last year. So is that the borrowing you're referencing, is that by chance the 2008 and the 2009 series borrowing?
You had a couple. I think the sewage treatment plant was maybe a little earlier unless it got refinanced. But yes, 2008, 2009 were big ones, but I think there's one earlier than that.
So I have the 2008 and the 2009 are 14 and a half apiece, 14.5 and 14.6 actually. So your $30 million recollection is pretty spot on. And then I have a Series 2010 for about 2.3 million, and 2007 for 1.3, and then a 2006A for 6 million. And then I think the other ones once you get beyond those are the funds that we're drawing down currently, on currently to fund those I&I projects is my recollection on the fund. And then your earliest reprieve on some of these starts in about 2029, but those aren't the large ones. The large ones start to fall off in about 2031.
Thank you.
turning our attention to stormwater. And again, part of the issue with stormwater is that we created the fund. It's the most recently created fund. We created it several years ago when we went to a utility fee. I think that, boy, time passes, but I think we did that in about 2015 or so after we had been designated as an MS4 community. And initially, we did not move debt service into the fund. And we subsequently have moved the debt service for existing stormwater projects that were in that resided in the general fund into the stormwater fund, and so that it is carrying all of the expenses related to stormwater improvement. But as time has passed, as I say, some of the emphasis of the fund has gone from purely capital improvement to a much more emphasis on regulatory compliance. And so what we see is that will happen with this fund, you see a much larger transfer from net position, $116,000, to cover expenses in the fund. That it's, you'll see us come to you with not only, dump trucks and heavy equipment, but street sweepers and those kinds of capital rolling stock, as well as just the types of maintenance and small capital projects we take on with our own crews there. But that fund really does not have the kind of retained earnings that the other funds do. It just hasn't been around as long and doesn't generate nearly as much money. So what will, in this fund, I think our spendable retained earnings is about $250,000 and on a fund that's, operating in, at $1.4 million or so in the current year. And you really, that $250,000 would be a little less than the minimum you would want to hold in the fund for an emergency. So part of the strategy in this fund was to increase the rate by 30% over 2 fiscal years in order to cover both operation capital rolling stock costs, but also start to stabilize the retained earnings in the fund. I give fair warning that as we look into future years, not necessarily 2022, but as you look to future years, this TMDL issue is going to become an expensive one. One of the things that we had been getting a lot of credit for through the state was for street sweeping, that you sweep a lot of nutrients and some heavy metals off of streets. And so we actually calculate the weight of that grit and material removed, and we report it to the state, and we were getting pretty good credit for that. But the state revised its system for evaluating the efficacy of pollution reduction through that activity, and we're not getting as much credit as we used to there. So I think the result is going to be that you'll see over time that we'll have to come back with more capital projects that look something like the Mulberry Run project or smaller projects, stream bank restoration projects, and things of that nature. But as I say, I think that one of the strong messages here is that the rate increase really is meant to be able to continue to do the things that we're doing today in terms of regulatory compliance and maintenance work. But the fund is not in great shape. It doesn't have the kind of depth of retained earnings that you have in especially water or sewer fund. In terms of refuse, in the refuse fund, we've traditionally been able to keep rates really low in comparison to other providers in the region and even other providers within the city. The city of Waynesboro is somewhat peculiar in that we don't have an exclusive right to all of the customers, refuse customers in the city. And a lot of cities, basically, they exclude private refuse collection. And I think that's a good thing. I think that we're willing to compete with the market, and in fact, we beat the market now. Part of that is because we're a partner in a landfill, and what's the big thing with refuse collection that is going to become a bigger thing for the city of Waynesboro is where do you dump your trash? It's not that it's a lot of service provision, and it does take heavy equipment to collect trash, but it's a lot more expensive to dump trash. And so, as we looked at the refuse fund and we could foresee that there were going to be big capital plans and projects out at the Augusta County Service Authority landfill, we realized we need to start setting money aside for that. And we did start a fund. We have probably $300,000 or $350,000 set aside here. We have some capital money over at the landfill, but it will not cover the cost that we're going to incur there in the coming years. And so we're proposing some rate increases. We would have liked to have started last year with $1.50, but again, deferred that. I think if you look at, where we are in comparison, this is from the rate study that we did in 2019, but if you look at where we are in comparison to some of our neighboring communities, we're certainly lower, and we're lower than, we put up one hauler here. We know there are a couple of others, and their rates are quite similar. So you see us at $14.50, and we're pretty affordable. City of Stanton actually has increased their rate to $20.88 per month since this study was done. And then if you look at Lynchburg and Winchester, we found that they help subsidize their refuse collection with general fund tax dollars. And again, we don't do that, self-funding. So I think even at $16, we're going to look like a bargain in the market. And again, we compete. If there are other haulers in the city of Waynesboro that people can turn to. I think I'd like to get some help from Mr. McCormick to talk about the landfill and our funding strategy there, what we anticipate in terms of capital improvement, and what our obligation will be there.
Sure. So you basically have two big things that are driving capital need there. When we went in, the phase 4 was already constructed, and they are getting ready to begin construction on phase 5, which is a 9-acre or so site. Just the construction on that, without the engineering, is about $3.6 million. The engineering is about $300,000, and that's Mr. Hamp's recollection on this may go back further. We've been talking about that project for a while, but it's generally been 3-4 years out, and now it's becoming a reality that they can only do so much compaction. They're going to have to open a new cell sooner rather than later. The other big project that's going on out there in 2024 is some site improvements. They have some issues with where the scales are. I don't know how familiar you are with the landfill, but currently when you pull into the public use site, you come in on the scales on the right-hand side, and they don't have the ability to weigh you in and weigh you out because they're driving you across the scales. What the director there is suggesting is to pull the scale house further back in so that they can weigh commercial customers on the way in and on the way out. And so right now they're basically working off of tears. So they know what the truck weighs at some point when they take it out there the first time empty, and then they know what it weighs on the way in, and they're calculating the difference to charge those commercial haulers. The public use site dumps for free currently. So long story short, that results in two pretty significant pieces that we have to pay approximately 21% of. So what this chart does, it takes the reserve funds. Those are if you look at your CAFR at the GL, there's a reserve for ACSA. I think it might be lumped with the Public Works and the CAFR, but the piece that's meant for ACSA, or Augusta County Service Authority, is $350,000. The second line is the refuse fund contribution that would be funded through any rate increases, and then the very bottom line is the projected cash need, and that's what's provided by the provided by the landfill on what they're going to need to cover our portion. So the first year, 2021, projections $165,000. So that would leave you a surplus on your reserve funds of about 185. And then I should back up to the top. The rate is shown at 14.50 in 2021. That's the current piece. The rate increase is building on itself. So the $1.50 builds on the $14.50 to take it to $16. The dollar builds on the $16 to take it to $17 in 2023, so on. So in the second line, or in the second year, 2022, next budget year, the refuse fund would be able to contribute about $124,000 to that. Projected cash need is $210,000 for that year, so that leaves you with a surplus of about $99,000. The next year, the refuse fund contribution between the rate increases would be about $204,000. Your projected cash need is $750,000, which would leave you $447,000 in the hole. Now, you don't need to get all the way up to cover the $750,000 every year. You're going to have two relatively large capital projects hit you right back to back. What you can do is smooth that a little bit with basically you would send the transfer to ACSA because they have to pay for it. You would pay it from the general fund and then basically incur a debt from the refuse fund to the general fund for whatever the surplus deficit is. And then at that point, you would be paying your general fund back for the next few years until you got to approximately negative $140,000. And that's as far as I have projections for, but assuming that the projected cash needs hold another year, you would be in you break even or be very close the following year. We can play with this, and it's a potential landfill funding strategy. If you pull the 2024 rate increase back to 2023 and you do $2, you'll have that cash on hand that first year, and then you'll have a $2 the next. So you'll get an extra year of that dollar, which may be enough to offset that 140. Again, this was just a funding strategy that was, this is just one option. You could go at this a number of different ways, with the bottom line being, the main piece being deciding whether or not, what big of piece the refuse fund is going to hold on, because if you leave it, the rates where they are now, it's going to end up falling to your general fund to pay for the projects.
I would note that in the rate study that we did in 2019, that the consultant actually recommended a much more aggressive approach to rate increases, and that, as Mr. McCormick's alluded to, we thought that maybe an approach that smoothed the increase over time, but that would, that ends up essentially having the refuse fund borrow from the general fund, pay that back over time, might be something that the council would want to entertain. It's maybe a little more palatable. And as Mr. McCormick notes, that if we thought these costs were going to be ongoing, we wouldn't propose this. But we think you'll have this cost. Hopefully, then the sale lasts for a number of years, and then some future council deals with it in a similar way, that you build up to the expenditure over some period of time. So I think that concludes the enterprise funds presentation. We took more time this year with the enterprise than we have in the past. I think sometimes we have felt like we do a quick enterprise review at the end of the budget presentation, and that we don't give it its due. I think again, these are big operations, and in this particular year, we're unfortunately coming to you with requests for rate increases in those funds, but I think they are necessary, for basic operation of the funds as they stand, and their long-term financial stability. So with that, we'll entertain questions, or we open it up to conversation among the council.
Mr. Shaw, is this just about the enterprise fund that you're asking questions for?
Well, Mr. Allen, Mr. Mayor, I think it's your meeting, and whatever is your pleasure, sir.
But I'm just saying that, flashing back to when Mr. Short was talking about there's grant money out there that's available for infrastructure. And I just wondered if there's anything that you're aware of that's out there that we haven't applied for, or, I mean, anytime we can get anything, it would help pay. I would be interested in hearing about that.
Certainly. And there are, we do see some opportunities especially as you look at some of the things that we may have to do either in the sewer fund or the stormwater fund, that we've through the years been able to take pretty good advantage of a couple of state programs. There's a revolving loan fund that is available for a lot of the work you do either in water or sewer if you're doing pollution control. And then a lot of folks match that with also a state grant. So you'll see that revolving loan fund and state grants kind of go hand in hand in water and sewer funds. With refuse, it's a little tougher. I mean, that we do get some small grants for solid waste and recycling, but they tend to be really quite small. But we certainly, our folks, try to stay in tune with what are the grants out there to help. There are some things, smaller grants that come through to the Department of Health where water quality is concerned. We use some of the CDBG grants in recent years for utility projects. If we have small stormwater, water, sewer projects in neighborhoods, we've taken advantage of CDBG grants for some of that. And they're not big, but it takes a little stress off the fund. So we look for those opportunities where they exist.
Thank you, sir.
A question that occurred to me as you're talking about some of the DEQ requirements or anticipated of some new challenges for stormwater. Does the South River Preserve project enter into that conversation? And if so, do we know how yet?
Dr. Hostetter, I'd really want to talk to a fellow on our staff, Trafford McRae, who's an environmental engineer scientist that works in the City Public Works Division, to see where we landed exactly. We were angling to get some credit from work that DuPont was doing. And, there's a hitch that you hit in some of those credits, is that you can't necessarily take credit for something that's being compelled through regulatory compliance. And so DuPont was being compelled through regulatory compliance to do a lot of that work. Now, having said that, there are some things that we're going to do within the South River Preserve that we're taking on with grant funds. There's a stormwater project that we're going to do on the west side of the river that's to complement work that's being funded through NERDA. And then as well, I think you saw a grant project that's some stream restoration along the Rock Chris Run that complements the NERDA work that we should get some credit for. So it's a little bit of a mixed bag, and I'd have to quiz Mr. McRae exactly where we ended up.
Anyone else have anything? All right, Mr. Hamp, what's next for us?
So what's next is, you may recall last night I mentioned the possible need to confirm public hearings related to the budget. And as I prepared for the meeting and reflected on what we had accomplished thus far, it occurred to me that it's my view that by virtue of having adopted a calendar, I think we can regard that the council has confirmed the plan for public hearings. And so we will prepare and run those ads to conduct the public hearing on the utility rates, the tax rate and budget for the Monday, April 26th meeting. We'll hold that meeting at Waynesboro High School. The other thought I had, and I don't know that I have a concluding thought or recommendation, but we'll seek some input from the council. Our next scheduled work session regarding the budget is April the 28th, which is 2 days after that April 26th regular business meeting. And so it may be, it's entirely up to the council. If the council would like to spend some additional time together and extend some of the conversation and discussion that you've had and perhaps work to consensus or clarity on outstanding questions in the budget, we might look to that week of the 19th of April to schedule an additional work session. Alternatively, we can hold the public hearings and then meet as scheduled on the 28th, but we'll have at that point to work a little more efficiently and expeditiously to reach consensus and achieve tax rate and expenditure plans that can be adopted by the council. So again, that's a thought that I had. You can mull that. If there's immediate consensus, we can make a plan tonight. Otherwise, you can mull it and perhaps communicate through the mayor what the council's preference is. Other than that, I don't have anything additional.
Mr. Hamp, you mentioned that the public hearings scheduled for the 26th are at the high school. My understanding was that originally the 12th was going to be at the high school. Is that still the plan?
Yes, that's still the plan.
Okay.
So again, the 12th is a regular business meeting at which we will have a public hearing on the general reassessment of real property.
Okay.
That experience is simply, as required by the Code of Virginia, allows your constituents to come and give feedback on the general reassessment. It doesn't prompt council to take specific action regarding the reassessment, but presumably the council will take the information that you get that evening and incorporate it into your thinking around the budget as we work forward on the 26th. And it doesn't replace the need to have a distinct and separate public hearing on the tax rate itself.
Okay. I thought that was what we were talking about. I just wanted to make sure I hadn't missed something.
Yes, sir.
Does everyone's schedules look good for the 19th and 28th? Shaking his head yes.
I think I can be there on the 19th.
Okay.
Yes.
Sure. Thumbs up.
Mr. Ham, could you clarify again what the public hearing is going to be about? You said utilities on the 26th?
So, right, the 26th will hold, let me see here. We will have four separate public hearings. One on the various utility rates.
Okay.
One on the cemetery rates. One on tax rates. And one on the overall budget.
Okay.
You know, at that point, you're thinking mostly about the relationship between expenditures to a tax rate.
Okay.
And that's just a function of the Code of Virginia requires elected bodies to hold separate and distinct public hearings on those various elements of a budget.
Okay. Thank you for clarifying that.
Are you good on the 19th, Lana?
Yes.
Okay. You want me to plan on being out of town on the 26th so you can run that other meeting?
No,
No, just kidding.
I think you can have that one.
Okay. All right. Well, Mike, it sounds like everybody's in agreement with the dates that you put out there. If we want to just go ahead and get them scheduled.
Yes, sir. We'll do that.
Okay.
I would like to thank the council for devoting consecutive evenings to this process. We appreciate that, and we hope that you've found this experience informative and helpful as you work through a budget. And then we also recognize that we have some outstanding information that we'll compile and present on the 19th.
No,
I just want to reiterate that too, Mike. I think my appreciation for all of the hard work and leading up to these last two nights. I would agree. A lot of times this enterprise fund kind of gets like, oh my gosh, boy, we talked about the general fund. Let's kind of get over with the. So I appreciated that context tonight. I thought this was very helpful and informative. So thank you.
Thank you.
And I have to agree with that also. I like this format where we can sit down and talk amongst ourselves and hear other ideas. This has been a good experience.
Great.
All right. With that, let's just go ahead and close the meeting out and eat dinner.
Good night.
Yeah,
All right,
sounds
good night.
great. Good night.
Evening.
Thank you.